Fort Caldwell, Virginia, spring 1943. A perfectly good tank sits in the middle of a concrete workshop floor, not damaged, not broken, not pulled from any battlefield. This tank rolled off the assembly line 6 weeks ago. Its armor is clean, its engine runs. By every measure that matters to the United States Army, it is combat ready. And yet right now 2 engineers are unbolting its turret. Not repairing it, not upgrading it, removing it entirely. The guns come off next. Every weapon stripped away, 1 bolt at a time, until what remains is just a steel hull, a shell of a fighting machine that can no longer fight. Officers standing along the wall of the workshop watch in silence. One of them leans toward the man beside him and asks the question they are all thinking. What exactly is it supposed to do? Nobody answers, because the man who could answer that question is not in this room. He is somewhere else entirely, somewhere, and most of the army brass would prefer he stayed there. Go back 8 months. Go back to where this story really begins. August 1942. A stretch of coastline called Port Kessler. The plan looked good on paper. It always does. Allied command had identified Port Kessler as a strategic target, a fortified position that, if taken, would demonstrate the capacity for large-scale coastal assault and give Allied planners the intelligence they needed for future operations. Over 6,000 troops were assembled, tanks were loaded onto landing craft. The 2nd Infantry Division prepared for what was supposed to be a coordinated, decisive strike. There was just one problem. Nobody had actually looked at the beach, not properly, not in person. Military intelligence had assessed the terrain at Port Kessler using available resources. Photographs, mostly civilian photographs. The kind of photographs that tourists take on summer holidays. Wide shots of the coastline, families in the foreground, bright sky above. The analysts looked at those photographs and made their calculations. Sandy shore, gradual approach, manageable terrain. What no holiday snapshot ever captures is what the ground is made of beneath your feet. Port Kessler Beach was covered in shingle, not sand, not firm earth. Shingle, rounded stones between 1 and 6 inches across, packed together at a 15 to 20 degree angle, shifting and sliding under any weight that crossed them. The moment the first landing craft dropped its ramp, the moment the first tank rolled forward onto that beach, what happened next was not a battle, it was a trap. The stones jammed between the drive sprockets and the track links almost immediately. Track pins snapped under the stress, tracks came away entirely. Of the tanks that reached the beach, more than half were immobilized within minutes of landing, not by enemy fire, not by anti-tank weapons, but by rocks, by the kind of rocks you could pick up and skip across a pond. 27 tanks reached that shore. 27 tanks were destroyed or abandoned before a single one entered the town. The infantry had no cover. The engineers had no protection. And the concrete roadblocks at every exit from the beach, each one covered by machine guns, by 37mm guns, by 75mm guns firing from fixed positions. Those roadblocks were not going to move on their own. Someone had to go clear them. Lieutenant Thaddeus Kowalski was 23 years old. He was a combat engineer, which meant his job was to go to the places where the fighting was worst and solve the problems that were killing everyone else. At Port Kessler, that meant approaching the roadblocks with demolition charges, crossing open ground under direct enemy fire, reaching concrete barriers that stood between the stranded infantry and any possible advance. He went. 6 men in his team went with him. By the time Kowalski reached the shadow of a burned-out tank and pressed himself flat against the shingle, 5 of those men were already down. He lay there for 4 hours, barely breathing. The noise around him, the sustained, overlapping roar of weapons firing from positions that commanded every inch of that beach, was not the sound of a battle being fought. It was the sound of a battle already decided. When it was finally over, when the order came to withdraw what remained, Kowalski walked back across that beach and looked at what had happened. Nearly 60% casualties, thousands of men killed, wounded or captured, every tank gone. He would spend the next several months writing a report that almost no one in authority wanted to read. The conclusion was simple and devastating. Unprotected soldiers could not clear obstacles under direct enemy fire. Until engineers had armor around them when they went to work, operations like Port Kessler would keep ending the same way. What Kowalski did not know as he wrote that report was that the man who might have prevented Port Kessler from happening at all was currently standing guard duty at a logistics depot in Northern Virginia. His name was Garfield Briggs. Everyone who knew him called him Gar. The United States Army called him a problem. He was 58 years old. He had spent 30 years of his career thinking about one subject with a depth and focus that made most of his colleagues uncomfortable: how to move armored forces across broken terrain, through obstacles, against fortified positions, faster and more effectively than any enemy could respond to. He had studied it, written about it, built training programs around it. In 1936, he had taken a collection of poorly equipped, poorly organized armored units and turned them into something that actually resembled a modern fighting force. He was brilliant, he was relentless, and he was completely impossible to work with if you disagreed with him, because he had an unfortunate habit of being right. His superiors eventually decided they had had enough. The official record, when Briggs was removed from command in March of 1941, described an officer whose tactical thinking relied excessively on armored capability to the exclusion of other combat arms. That was the professional language. The informal language, used in conversations that were never written down, was simpler. Gar Briggs told too many generals they were wrong, and eventually the generals had enough votes to do something about it. He was 56 when they let him go. He was 58 when the war he had spent decades preparing for finally arrived at scale, and the army that had dismissed him began making exactly the mistakes he had warned them about. There is a particular quality to that kind of silence. The silence of a man who has been told he is wrong, who has watched events confirm that he was right, and who has no platform from which to say so. Briggs did not rage against it. He was not the kind of man who raged. He absorbed it the way good armor absorbs a hit, taking the impact, converting it to heat, and continuing to function. He enlisted in the Virginia National Guard. They gave him the rank of Private First Class. The man who had once commanded 30,000 troops put on a private's uniform and reported for duty. He stood watch at a logistics depot outside Richmond. He filed the paperwork the Guard required. He did not call in favors. He did not make noise. He waited with the particular patience of someone who knows the situation is going to get worse before anyone admits it needs to change. It was a journalist who broke the silence. His name was Reeve Finch, and he wrote for Armed Forces Review. Not a publication that most civilians would recognize, but one that the right people read. Officers, analysts, people in Washington who followed the war with professional attention. Finch's piece ran in October of 1942, 2 months after Port Kessler. The title was measured and the argument was not. He was not interested in celebrating Briggs. He was interested in indicting the institution that had discarded him. His central point was straightforward. The United States Army, facing the most complex mechanized warfare in human history, had in its possession a man who had spent 30 years solving the exact problems currently killing American soldiers, and that man was standing guard outside a supply warehouse in Northern Virginia. President Everett Drummond read every word. What happened next was unusual enough that it still surprises military historians who encounter it in the archival record. Drummond did not call a meeting. He did not ask his staff for a briefing. He picked up a pen and wrote a letter, by hand, on White House stationery, addressed personally to Garfield Briggs at the depot where he was stationed. The letter was 4 sentences. The fourth read, "We are at war, General. I need the right man for this, not the safe one." There is a photograph, taken sometime in the weeks that followed, of Briggs reading a document at a desk. His expression reveals nothing, controlled, contained, giving no signal of what is moving behind the eyes. But the document in his hands is the orders restoring him to active duty. And if you look carefully at his left hand, at the way the fingers press flat against the edge of the paper, you can see the grip of a man holding something he was not sure he would ever hold again. He was given command of the 79th Armored Division in March of 1943. Not a fighting division in the conventional sense, a laboratory. A unit whose explicit purpose was to develop specialized armored vehicles that standard military procurement had refused to consider. He was given authority, resources, and one condition. Results before the summer of 1944, 18 months. To build something that had never been built before. What he did not know when he accepted those orders, what he would only discover afterward, was that the quiet institutional pressure helping clear the path for his reinstatement had come partly from General Conrad Aldridge. Aldridge was a senior officer with influence over personnel decisions and budget allocations. He was also the man who had been married to Ruth Briggs, Gar's younger sister, until Ruth died of illness in the spring of 1937. The two men had never grown close the way brothers-in-law sometimes do. The connection between them was Ruth, and when Ruth was gone, the formal structure of the relationship dissolved. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in the 6 years since. But Aldridge had made calls, had mentioned the right names in the right rooms, had done, quietly and without announcement, what the institution itself had failed to do. Briggs found out 3 weeks after his appointment was confirmed. He sent one brief message through official channels acknowledging the information, then he went back to work. That was Gar Briggs, not cold, not ungrateful, simply focused in a way that left very little room for anything that was not the problem directly in front of him. And so we come back to Fort Caldwell, back to that workshop floor, back to the engineers removing a turret from a perfectly good tank while officers watch and struggle to understand what they are looking at. The tank on that floor is not being destroyed, it is being repurposed, turned from something that fights into something that does a different kind of work. The kind of work that has to happen before any fighting can succeed. The kind of work that saved no headlines because it happened in ditches and riverbeds and at the bases of concrete walls out of sight, while everything that mattered was occurring somewhere else. Briggs walked into that workshop on his first day at Fort Caldwell and said one thing that none of his senior staff had expected to hear from a general of his rank. Every suggestion from every man in this division will be heard, regardless of rank. If a private in this unit has an idea that might work, I want to know about it before he talks himself out of saying it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people recalibrating, of officers who had spent careers in an institution where rank determined which ideas mattered, suddenly being told the rules were different here. Thaddeus Kowalski, now a lieutenant, reassigned to Fort Caldwell after his Port Kessler report had finally found its way to the right desk, was standing at the back of that room. He was 24 years old. He had written about what engineers needed to do their work without getting killed. He had argued for armor, for protection, for vehicles that could reach the obstacles without exposing the men clearing them to open fire. He had not expected to be in a room where someone actually wanted to hear it. The general was 58, the lieutenant was 24, and between them, in the months that followed, they were going to build something that had never existed before. Fort Caldwell in the summer of 1943 did not look like a place where history was being made. It looked like a place where things kept going wrong. Vehicles sat in the testing yard with their hatches open and engines pulled. Engineers lay flat on their backs in the dirt, reaching up into machinery with tools that were not quite right for the job. Blackboards filled with calculations got erased and rewritten so many times the chalk dust had settled permanently into the wood. There were arguments, quiet ones mostly, the kind that happen between men trying to solve a problem with no obvious solution and a shrinking amount of time. Briggs moved through all of it the same way, deliberately. He had a habit of arriving before anyone else in the morning and staying after everyone had gone at night, not to demonstrate commitment, but because the silence helped him think. He would stand in front of whatever they were currently building and simply look at it, not taking notes, not speaking. The way a man looks at something he knows is not yet right and is trying to locate exactly where the wrongness lives. Kowalski learned to leave him alone during those moments. Once he figured that out, it took about 2 weeks, the working rhythm between them settled into something functional. Kowalski brought the technical problems. Briggs brought the strategic framing. Between them, they began building something the Army had no official category for, because nothing like it had existed before. The concept, stripped to its bones, was this. Every failed assault on a fortified position, Port Kessler, every operation like it, broke down at the same moment. Not when the first shot was fired, not when the tanks hit the beach. The failure happened earlier, and more specifically than that, it happened the moment the advancing force encountered a vertical obstacle it could not cross. A seawall, a concrete roadblock, a riverbank, a ditch. The moment when the armor stopped, and the infantry behind it had nowhere to go, and the engineers who might have cleared the obstacle had to cross open ground on foot to reach it. More firepower was not the answer. Port Kessler had proven that. Firepower aimed at a concrete wall does not remove the wall, it removes the men standing near it. The solution was stranger than anything procurement had been willing to consider. You take a tank hull, armored, protected, capable of crossing rough terrain. You remove everything on top. The turret, the guns, every weapon. You bolt 2 steel ramps to what remains. Then you drive that hull directly into the obstacle, into the ditch, against the seawall, down into the riverbed, and you leave it there, stationary, entirely unable to defend itself, while every other tank in the column drives over it. The men inside stay at their positions. The vehicle becomes a bridge, a living bridge, crewed by men who have surrendered every means of self-defense in order to make it possible for 40 tons of steel to roll across the top of their heads. Kowalski had sketched the first rough version of this idea in his Port Kessler report, working from the specific problem he had watched kill his men. Briggs read those sketches and saw not just a technical solution, but a doctrine, a way of thinking about the relationship between armor and obstacles that could apply across every terrain the Allied advance would encounter. He called it the arc, not a formal designation, just what he called it. In the workshop, in the testing yard, in the early mornings when he stood alone in front of the hull and thought about whether they were building it right. The ramp mechanism took 3 months to get correct. The first versions were hydraulic. They jammed in cold weather, they jammed in mud. They failed at moments with no logical explanation other than that machinery fails when you need it most. 3 separate demonstrations ended the same way. Ramps stuck halfway between travel position and deployment. Each time, Briggs said the same word. Simpler. Kowalski rebuilt the mechanism without hydraulics, purely mechanical. Hinged ramps folded upward for transit, released by a manual catch operable from inside the vehicle. No fluid lines to freeze, no pressure systems to fail. Deployment time dropped under 60 seconds. Reliability across 47 consecutive tests in varying conditions approached complete. The trackway configuration took another month. The front ramp needed to be shorter, designed to drop onto the top of a seawall and lock against it, using a ratchet catch that the vehicle's own tracks would press into place. The rear ramp needed to extend back toward the beach below, giving following vehicles a continuous surface. Every dimension had been argued over, tested, revised, and tested again. By the time the first production arc was completed in late 1943, there was not a bolt on it that had not been questioned at least once. Briggs signed off on the design on a Thursday morning in November. He walked around the vehicle twice, ran his hand along the length of the ramp, looked at the sealed turret ring where the gun had been, nodded once, then walked back to his office and began working on the next problem. There was one experiment that did not go according to plan. A separate engineering team proposed a variant they called the extended bridge carrier, where the standard arc could span a gap of perhaps 15 feet. This version would use rocket-deployed ramps to bridge 60 feet of open air and climb a 12-foot wall. One vehicle, one operation, 60 feet. Briggs listened to the proposal for 30 minutes without interrupting. Then, build it, run the trial. 10 vehicles were converted. The design was tested at a facility outside Fort Caldwell on a Tuesday in early 1944, with officers from 3 separate commands present to observe. The rockets fired on schedule. What happened next was not what anyone had planned. The rockets were more powerful than the calculations predicted, significantly more powerful. The force they generated did not primarily drive the ramps forward along the intended trajectory. Instead, it drove the entire chassis downward. And then, as reaction physics asserted itself with complete indifference to military planning, the rear of the vehicle lifted clean off the ground, all 40 tons of it. The tank was briefly, unmistakably airborne at the rear, rearing up like something startled before it came back down at an angle that deposited it several feet from its original position. The ramps had not deployed correctly, the bridge had not formed. The officers watching said nothing. Briggs stood at the observation line for 30 seconds, completely still. 30 seconds is a long time when everyone around you is waiting to see how a general reacts to watching 40 tons of steel briefly leave the earth. Then he turned to Kowalski. Note in the record, partial success. A pause. We continue with the original design. He walked back to his vehicle without further comment. The failure was filed. The next problem was already on the board. He had learned across 30 years of building things that sometimes broke that the most expensive thing you can do after a failure is stay in the room with it longer than necessary. 10 extended carriers had been built. None of them would see combat before Germany surrendered. The idea was sound. The execution had run out of time. That was all. January 1944. The demonstration that would determine whether any of it mattered. Briggs had spent months preparing it. The full range of what his division had produced, every variant, every specialized vehicle, was assembled at a testing ground outside Fort Caldwell, laid out in sequence so an observer could walk through the logic from beginning to end. Swimming tanks for the approach, flail tanks to clear mines from the beach, flame-throwing tanks for hardened positions, engineering vehicles carrying the means to blow concrete obstacles apart. And at the end of the sequence, the Ark, the thing with no weapons, the thing that drove into a hole and stayed there. General Conrad Aldridge was present. So was General Ellsworth Ware, the officer who controlled the allocation of armored forces to the planned Allied landings in France. Ware was in his mid-50s, a competent officer with extensive experience in conventional armored operations and a reputation for decisions that were sound, if rarely imaginative. Briggs gave no speech before the demonstration began. He stood to one side and let the vehicles speak for themselves. For 2 hours they watched. The swimming tanks crossed a flooded area that would have stopped conventional armor. The flail tank beat a path through a simulated minefield without a single detonation. The engineering vehicle fired its weapon at a concrete replica of a Port Kessler roadblock and turned it to rubble in 4 seconds. The Ark drove into a prepared ditch, dropped its ramps, and held a Class 40 load, a fully equipped, fully armed tank, across its back without flexing a millimeter. Ware was complimentary, genuinely so. He understood what he was seeing. But when the formal discussion began that afternoon, his position was clear and his reasoning was specific. The specialized vehicles ran on a different chassis from the Sherman's American forces would operate in France. Accepting Briggs' vehicles meant separate parts, separate maintenance protocols, separate training pipelines, all to be established and operational before June. Too complex, too late, too much to absorb into a supply chain already stretched to its limits. He thanked Briggs. He shook his hand. He left. The staff on the drive back to Fort Caldwell knew better than to fill the silence. 40 minutes through the Virginia countryside, bare fields, a frozen creek, the kind of winter landscape that is neither beautiful nor ugly, just present. And Briggs said nothing. He looked out the window and let the numbers run in his head and kept whatever conclusions he arrived at to himself. What the official record does not show, because it was not released until 26 years after the fact, is what happened 5 days later. Ware sent a formal request to the War Department. 25 flail tanks, 100 flame-throwing vehicles. The British Production Office confirmed it could supply them. The deal was agreed. The problem was arithmetic. The production facilities converting tanks into Briggs's specialized vehicles were already operating at capacity. The timeline between January and June 1944, 5 months, was not sufficient to fill both Allied and American requirements. The tanks Ware had requested would not arrive in operational numbers before the landings began. Ware had not refused out of arrogance. He had not failed to understand what Briggs had built. The calendar said no, and the calendar was the one thing no general in that war could argue with. When Briggs received the classified summary of this exchange, he read it once and filed it. He absorbed the information, placed it alongside everything else he knew about how these decisions were made, and continued working. Some facts do not change the situation. They only change how clearly you see it. The night of June 5th, 1944. Briggs was at his desk at Fort Caldwell. The landings at the French coast were beginning in the early hours of the morning. The largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare, and Briggs was not there. His vehicles were largely absent from the initial assault. The ARK had played almost no role in the opening waves. The sea walls at the British and Canadian beaches were handled by other means: AVRE vehicles, bridge layers, bulldozers. The siblings of the ARK had solved the problem first. At Omaha Beach, the American sector, the situation was different. The swimming tanks launched 5,000 yards offshore into heavy seas. Most of them went down before reaching the shallows. The infantry hit the beach behind almost nothing. Briggs knew the outline of the plan. He knew what was and was not going to be waiting for the men who hit Omaha in the morning. He opened his personal journal and wrote one entry. It was not discovered until 1970, when his papers were donated to an archive in Washington. If I was right about Port Kessler, and I was right about Port Kessler, then tonight there will be more mothers who lose sons than there needed to be. I have spent 2 years trying to prevent that. I do not want to be right about this. I would rather have been wrong about everything than be right about this. He closed the journal, turned off the desk lamp. Outside, Virginia was quiet in the way places are quiet when the people in them do not know what is happening 5,000 miles away. No sirens, no aircraft, just the ordinary silence of a summer night in a country where the fighting was somewhere else. Briggs sat in the dark and did what soldiers do when there is nothing left to do. He waited for morning and he counted the cost of decisions made in rooms he had not been invited into, and he said nothing to no one because there was nothing to say that would change what was already happening on a beach in France. When the first light came through the window, he stood up, put on his jacket, and went back to work. The reports from Normandy arrived in pieces, not as a clean summary with numbers arranged in rows. They came the way bad news always comes, in fragments, each one adding something to a picture that was already difficult to look at. A casualty count revised upward twice before it stabilized. a sector assessment that contradicted the one before it, a final tally that nobody had wanted to write down. Briggs read them at his desk over the course of 3 days. He kept them to himself. His staff would learn what they needed to know when they needed to know it. Gold Beach, British sector. Full complement of specialized armor deployed in the leading wave, flail tanks clearing mines before the infantry touched the sand, AVRE vehicles driving directly to the seawalls and blowing them apart with demolition mortars, engineers inside steel rather than running across open ground on foot. The funnies arriving first, absorbing what the beach had to offer, breaking it open before the men behind them had to cross it. Casualties, approximately 1,100. Omaha Beach, American sector. The swimming tanks launched 5,000 yards offshore into a sea state the men who made that decision had not stood in. Most of them went down in the first minutes. The infantry hit the beach with no armor ahead of them, no engineers protected well enough to work, nothing between them and the guns on the bluffs except open sand and the distance they had to cross before any cover was possible. The bluffs commanded every yard of that beach. There was nowhere to go that was not already in someone's sights. Casualties, somewhere between 2,400 and 3,600, depending on which count you used and when you stopped counting. Briggs sat with those two numbers for a long time, not analyzing, not drawing operational conclusions, just sitting with the fact of them. The difference between 1,100 and 3,600 was not the bravery of the men who landed. It was not the quality of their training or the strength of their will. The difference was, in some measurable part, the consequence of a production line that ran out of time, of 5 months between January and June that were not enough, of a calendar that said no when the engineering had already said yes. He had written, the night before the landings, "I do not want to be right about this." He had been right about this. He stood up, he walked through the workshop without stopping and out the side door into the morning air. The men who saw him go did not follow. Some things a man has to carry the length of a yard by himself, and everyone who had worked with Briggs long enough recognized when they were looking at one of those moments. He came back inside after a while, sat down, began drafting the next phase of operational deployment. The war was not pausing to accommodate anyone's grief. Italy was waiting. And the Ark, which had waited on the margins of the largest operation of the war, was finally going to get its turn. Italy, autumn 1944. The Gothic line ran across the northern part of the Italian peninsula like a scar, a fortified defensive system built into terrain that seemed designed by geography itself to resist assault. Rivers with steep banks, ridgelines commanding every approach. Ground that turned to mud in the autumn rains and stayed that way for months. The 25th Tank Brigade was operating in this landscape with arcs attached to the 51st Royal Tank Regiment and the North Irish Horse. Corporal Wendell Pruitt was 26 years old, a mechanic from Columbus, Ohio, who had joined the Army expecting to maintain vehicles rather than operate them in conditions no vehicle had been designed for. He was assigned to an ARC crew in October 1944 and discovered, on his first operational deployment, what it actually meant to sit inside a steel hull with no weapons while the machine around him became a bridge. The ARC drove into the crossing point on the River Sevrio on October the 24th. Pruitt was in the driver's position. The ramps dropped. The vehicle settled into the riverbed with a lurch that felt like the ground deciding to accept you whether you wanted it to or not. Then the first tank crossed. He heard it before he felt it. A low compression that built from outside the range of normal hearing into something that occupied the entire interior. The vehicle vibrating at a frequency that had no equivalent in anything he had experienced before. Then the weight came through the hull, transmitted from the ramps down through the frame, pressing the ARC deeper into the riverbed. Pruitt sat with his hands on controls he was not using and understood for the first time with his body rather than his mind what this vehicle was asking of him. Not skill, not courage in any form he had been trained to recognize, just presence, just the willingness to stay. When the last vehicle crossed and the weight lifted, he reversed the arc out of the riverbed with the precision of a man who has just found the edges of his own composure and chosen not to go any closer. He parked the vehicle, climbed out, and stood beside the hull for a moment with one hand resting on the steel. Then he went to find something to eat. That was the Ark's combat debut. No photographs were released. The operation was classified at a level that kept it out of the dispatches. Somewhere at Fort Caldwell, Briggs received the operational summary and filed it. The tool worked. The next problem was already on the board. They moved through that autumn and winter the way the Italian campaign moved, slowly at cost, against terrain and weather, and an enemy that was prepared and dug in and going nowhere it did not choose to go. November brought the Arks through liberated towns whose names would not appear in most histories of the war. December brought mud unlike anything Pruitt had encountered before, deep, adhesive, with a quality suggesting the earth itself had taken sides. The division's after-action reports from this period are detailed in the way that military documents are when the men writing them are trying to process what they have seen by rendering it in precise language. Load capacity verified under operational conditions, deployment time reduced to 40 seconds in optimal terrain, ramp lock mechanism performed without failure across 37 consecutive operations. Briggs read every report, made margin notes, forwarded recommendations back to the engineering teams at Fort Caldwell. He was doing, at distance, what he had always done, thinking 2 problems ahead, building the next version of the thing while the current version was still in use. Not because the present problem was solved, but because the present problem was going to be followed by another one, and that was the nature of the work. April 1945, the valley of the River Seno, northern Italy. The Allied advance had reached a point where the terrain itself had become the primary obstacle. The German forces were retreating northward, but retreating the way experienced soldiers retreat, deliberately, destroying every crossing behind them, leaving the landscape as broken and impassable as possible. The River Seno had banks that rose more than 20 feet above the surrounding plain, not a gradual slope. A vertical cut, as if someone had taken a blade to the earth and removed a section of it clean. A standard bridge could not be brought up quickly enough. A Bailey bridge required time the operational tempo did not allow. The engineers on the ground looked at the problem from every angle and arrived at the same conclusion each time. There was no conventional solution. Kowalski was with the forward unit when the problem was formally presented. He looked at the riverbank for a long time. He thought about the basic principle of the arc. A vehicle sacrificing its own mobility to create passage for everything behind it. He thought about what happened when the obstacle was not a ditch or a seawall, but a 20-foot vertical drop and a 20-foot vertical rise. Then he thought about 2 arcs positioned correctly and what they might do together. The proposal that went back up the chain was brief and specific. 2 arcs. The first descends into the riverbed and positions against the near bank. The second is driven down the ramp of the first and positions against the far bank. Together, they form a continuous surface spanning a gap that no single vehicle could cross and no conventional engineering could address in the time available. It had never been done. No record existed of it being attempted. No manual covered it. No training protocol prepared anyone for the dozen things that could go wrong when you stacked 2 40-ton vehicles against each other in a riverbed and asked a column of armor to drive across the top. The proposal reached Briggs. He considered it for a period his staff later recalled as being shorter than the magnitude of the decision seemed to warrant. Then he gave his approval. No committee, no request for additional analysis, no escalation to higher command. He said yes because the engineering was sound, because the alternative was to stop, and because he had spent 2 years building a vehicle for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when the conventional options ran out and the only path forward required something that had not been done before. Pruitt drove the first ARK into the Senio riverbed on a morning in April, when the light was flat and cold, and the water running past the vehicle's tracks was the color of old pewter. He positioned against the near bank, dropped the ramps, felt the riverbed accept the weight. Then the second arc came down behind him. This was different from anything at the Sevrio. Different in a way that took him a moment to understand. At the Sevrio, the weight above him had been the weight of tanks crossing. Here, before any tank had moved, there was already something pressing down. The second arc coming to rest on the ramp above him, another crew, another set of men making the same calculation in the same dark. He could feel them, not literally, not through any sensation he could name, but in the way the load transferred through both vehicles together, each one holding what the other could not hold alone. The bridge was not one machine anymore, it was two crews, two sets of men who had agreed, without a word between them, to trust the same engineering at the same moment. Then the first tank hit the upper ramp and the weight became total. The compression that filled the interior of the vehicle was unlike the Sevrio in every way, not just heavier, different in character, layered, two vehicles transmitting load through each other, each one pressing the other against the banks, the whole structure locking tighter under the weight of each crossing rather than loosening. The Ark was not fighting the force, it was using it, tank after tank. Self-propelled guns, supply vehicles carrying ammunition and fuel for the advance, already continuing on the far bank. The column moved without stopping, without slowing, across a 20-foot riverbed that had been designed by terrain and deliberate destruction to stop an armored advance dead. Pruitt sat in the dark and breathed. He did not know, in that moment, that nothing like this had ever been done before. He did not know that the image being captured by a military photographer on the far bank would become one of the most extraordinary photographs of the entire war. Two arcs stacked in a riverbed, a tank moving across the top, the geometry of it so improbable that the image seems to require explanation before it makes sense. He knew the weight. He knew the dark. He knew the sound of 40 tons crossing the top of his head in an unbroken sequence. And he knew the moment, unmistakable, physical, felt through the entire hull, when the last vehicle cleared the ramp and the weight lifted, and the river made itself heard again over the receding sound of engines moving north. He reversed out of the riverbed, drove up the bank, parked on level ground and climbed out and stood in the April air and looked at the river for a long moment. Then he went to find Kowalski because Kowalski would want to know how the ramp lock had performed under the combined load. And that was the kind of thing that needed to go into the report before anyone forgot the details. That was Wendell Pruitt, not a man given to ceremony, not a man who needed the moment to be larger than it was. He had sat in the dark and held the weight, and the bridge had held. That was enough. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The 79th Armored Division was disbanded on August 20th of that same year. There was no ceremony of particular significance, no parade. The unit that had fielded nearly 7,000 specialized vehicles across northwest Europe and Italy, that had solved problems at Gold Beach and the River Sevrio and the Senio, and 100 unnamed crossings in between, was stood down, its personnel reassigned or discharged, its vehicles transferred or scrapped, Briggs retired. Not because the institution asked him to leave again. He was 60 years old, and he had built what he set out to build, and used it the way he had always believed it needed to be used, and there was nothing further he needed to prove to anyone, including himself. Kowalski went to Pennsylvania and spent the next 3 decades designing bridges for the state highway system. There is a bridge over a creek outside of Harrisburg that he considered his best work. It carries no particular fame. Most of the people who drive across it every day do not know who designed it or what he did before he learned to build bridges for civilians. Pruitt went back to Columbus and opened a garage. He repaired vehicles for 40 years. patient and precise in the way that men are when they have learned what the failure of a mechanical system actually costs. He did not talk much about the war to his customers. When he did not talk about the Seno. He talked about the moment at a testing ground in 1944 when the WWII first carried a full tank across its back in a successful trial, and the particular quality of the silence in the vehicle afterward, when everyone understood at the same moment that the thing they had built actually worked. One letter arrived at Briggs's house in the weeks after the division disbanded. The return address was General Conrad Aldridge, forwarded through official channels in the way men of that generation forwarded personal correspondence. The letter was 3 sentences. The third read, "Ruth would have understood what you built here, Gar, better than either of us." Briggs kept the letter. It was found in his desk when he died, in an envelope that had been opened and refolded many times. In 1963, the United States Army fielded the M60 Armored Vehicle Launched Bridge. Same principle. Turret removed, bridge mounted, drive to the obstacle, deploy, hold the weight. Over 400 were built. They served in 2 Gulf Wars. In 2023, a consignment of M60 AVLBS was shipped to Ukraine. Same logic, same geometry, same fundamental decision. To take a fighting vehicle, remove its capacity to fight, and trust that what it becomes is worth more than what it was. The idea that Garfield Briggs developed in a workshop at Fort Caldwell in 1943, that Thaddeus Kowalski helped engineer from the wreckage of Port Kessler, that Wendell Pruitt carried in a steel hull across the Sevrio and the Seno, that idea is still in service, still being driven into obstacles by crews who sit in the dark and hold the weight and trust the machine. There is a photograph in the archive, 2 arcs in a riverbed, a tank crossing the top. The scale wrong in a way that takes a moment to understand. The vehicle's too large, the gap too deep, the whole arrangement too improbable for the image to make immediate sense. It looks like something that should not be possible. It looks like something someone decided to do before asking whether it could be done. Germany tried bridge-laying tanks and abandoned the program. The production lines ran out of time before the right machines could reach the right beaches. And Briggs built the Ark, deployed it in combat, and stacked 2 of them together in a riverbed when one was not enough. Because that was the problem in front of him, and he was not in the habit of stopping at problems. That is the whole story. The bridge holds, the column moves, the men who built it go home and open garages and design highway overpasses and are not famous. And the idea they built outlives them by 80 years, and is still, today, somewhere in the world, being driven into a ditch by a crew that trusts the engineering and holds the weight of whatever needs to cross. That is not luck. That is what happens when the right man stays in the room long enough to finish the work.